Chapter 6 is titled The Revolution Within. So, while the American people are fighting a revolution against the British Crown, they are also, in a way, reshaping their own society from within. And this is a very complex thing to think about. There's three particular reasons that the revolution was happening. The American colonies obviously want their independence from British control. This is the most obvious. However, this is really a culmination of a century-long competition between European empires, namely Britain and France. If you remember, right before the Revolution, there had been a war, the 7 Years' War. Commonly, the North American part of that, because it was a global conflict, is known as the French and Indian War. So really, this is the small piece, I guess you could say, of a century-long conflict. And then, lastly, a philosophical question, hence my reference to Auguste Rodin's The Thinker sculpture. This philosophical question: what kind of a nation could an independent America be? And after achieving independence, they finally get to see the answer to that question. You have a very, very drastically changing social order. In tradition, a well-ordered society is all about obedience to authority, and rulers rule their subjects. Husbands rule over their household and their wives. Parents rule over their children. Employers rule over their servants and apprentices. Slave owners over slaves. This is all obedience to authority. That is the centerpiece of society in a traditional sense. So inequality had been a fundamental piece of the colonial social order ever since the founding of the British American colonies. Now, the big change comes in Jefferson's words in the Declaration that all men are created equal. What does this refer to specifically? Equality before the law. There is eventually rights of the accused in the Bill of Rights. We will cover that extensively when we cover the Constitution. Also, equality in political rights. Voting in a Republican democracy, which started out rather limited and has long since been stripped away of those limitations. If you were an adult citizen, meaning you are 18 years old, you can vote today. Equality of economic opportunity. Everyone is free to compete with each other and make a living. These, though, are extremely radical concepts in 1776 when the Declaration is written. And of course, the very famous line from the Declaration of Independence: "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Very, very radical. Now, throughout the Revolution, service in a militia is often considered, really, historically especially, upon reflection, as a school of democracy. In most states, the militia is lower class people. The rich rarely served. They would send a slave or a person that they bought, paid for, like hired to serve in their place. So being primarily lower class is important for two big reasons. Soldiers are indirectly taught how to be good citizens. Members of militia were often electing their own officers. They would demand this right. We should have a say in who our leadership in the military is going to be. This is a very, very democratic way of doing things. And so it's really teaching these lower class citizens how to be good citizens within a republic, which they hoped they would form after the revolution was done. Joining the military is also a way to stake claim to citizenship. This remains true even today. Immigrants who want a path to citizenship often join the United States military as a means to do so. Here's the famous painting of Lexington and Concord. This man here is probably Captain John Parker. And really, these citizens that banded together to fight the British were unknowingly a school of democracy. They were teaching each other how to be good citizens. The Revolution in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania, being a middle colony, is kind of, in a lack of better terms, in the middle of everything. There are elites in Pennsylvania that thought that the chaos of the Revolution would just lead to pure anarchy, that a rabble, shall you call it, would be leading this effort. Artisans, so people selling products that they have made, the lower classes, maybe farmers, they favor independence. Philadelphia's pro-independence movement is actually led by Thomas Paine, who we know, the author of Common Sense, and Benjamin Rush, another man who was a local doctor in Philadelphia and made a name for himself as one of the leaders of the revolution. Men like Paine and Rush oppose property qualifications for voting. So not only is it radical to support a republic, it is even further, or even more radical to want to do away with any property qualifications, instead believing that all free men should have the right to vote. This is extremely unpopular among the Second Continental Congress, particularly among men like John Adams. Later, during the constitutional debates, Alexander Hamilton reflects these beliefs that really the upper classes are better suited to leading a nation, and that lower class participation would be a bad thing. After independence is declared, the pro-revolutionary forces are able to successfully promote these ideas in the new state constitution, which then leads to other states referencing the PA Constitution. So a unicameral one-house legislature, office of the governor is abolished, so there is no longer an executive. This is a big difference between what we know today. I mean, even though we have a bicameral legislature today, we have a legislature. They had a legislature. There was no executive branch in their state constitution. All free men over the age of 21 who paid taxes, those were the requirements, could vote. Property ownership is not required to hold public office. Low-cost schools were to be established in every county. As a teacher, I can say this is close to my heart. I'm very proud that they deemed this to be a priority. And it obviously remained a priority. We provide a free universal public education for everyone, grades K through 12. And, of course, freedom of the speech, press, and religion is very specifically outlined and granted. These are radical ideas, even among other leaders like John Adams, we mentioned on the previous slide. Like, some people would look at this and say, wow, this is going even further than I think we should go. So, new state constitutions, some of which modeled closely after Pennsylvania, there's going to be a Republican form of government in every state. But how? This is the key. How are you going to do that? Men like John Dickinson, whose copy of the PA Constitution with handwritten notes is right over here on the right, preferred traditional property ownership requirements to vote. He thought that the Pennsylvania Constitution's provisions were far too democratic. And Adams, likewise, John Adams, promoted the idea of a balanced government via a bicameral two-house legislature similar to that of the House of Lords and the House of Commons in Britain. So, bicameral legislature, which we do now have today. John Adams, while he wanted independence from Britain, also deeply respected the British system and was adamant that the British system was a good model for states here in America. Religious toleration is a huge piece of the conversation. Religious freedom didn't just mean you could practice whatever religion you wanted, but also the concept of separation of church and state. This one meant that no one could be promoted in society, nor held back in society based on their religious beliefs. So the founders wouldn't probably go as far as we do in the modern world of there can't even be public displays on public property of anything considered religious. They really just wanted to make sure that it didn't promote or detract from someone's success in life. And the founders did believe, though, that religion, and not any specific or certain religion, but just being holy in general, would play an important role in shaping what they referred to as a virtuous citizenry. This is where the idea of civic virtue comes from. Self-sacrifice for the betterment of society. So it is civically virtuous, for example, to want to hold public office and not be paid for it. While we have federal and state government officials that are paid, many local officials are not paid. So a lot of the people who are serving in your community are not doing so because they're making anything from it. They're doing it because they're civically virtuous. Famous quote from Thomas Jefferson: "Erecting the wall of separation between church and state is absolutely essential in a free society." He did not believe that religion, again, should play any role in promoting someone or holding them back. Later in history, when running for president, John F. Kennedy was the first ever Catholic candidate and becomes the first ever Catholic president. And in a time period where the religious participation of the average American is still quite high, over the years, fewer people are active churchgoers. In 1960, when he ran for president, a good majority of the American people are religious. And the largest majority are Protestants, not Catholics. And anyway, he reassured a lot of people who wanted to vote for him but were unsure based on his Catholicism. He reassured them with this quote: "I believe in an America where no Catholic prelate would tell the president how to act, and no Protestant minister would tell his parishioners for whom to vote." Really, it comes down to he was reassuring people that I'm going to make my decisions as President of the United States based on what is best for the American people, based on the fact that I believe strongly in the separation of church and state. So, even much later in American history, in the 1960 presidential election, things like religious liberty, separation of church and state are still hot topics of debate. Now, what is the impact of the revolution on Native Americans? Well, to sum it up, it's devastating. The largest majority of Iroquois tribes remained loyal to Britain. Only really the Oneida Nation was allied with the Continental Army. So nearly the entire Iroquois Confederacy remains loyal to Britain, and this is primarily because of the Proclamation of 1763. They want to protect their lands, and they see that remaining loyal to Britain is their best way to do that. Now, there are some really, really sad stories of Native Americans being driven from their lands. Also, sad stories of things that were done by a war party led by a Mohawk named Joseph Brant, and also a story of General John Sullivan. It really comes down to, if I was to just give you a timeline of it all, Joseph Brant and his war party would go into areas that had been not allowed to be settled by the Proclamation of 1763, and people had settled anyway. And there were some pretty heinous, murderous crimes committed against people there. And given that the Iroquois Confederacy, it's a loose confederacy of these different tribes, and President Washington, I say President Washington, he's only General Washington at the time, eventually president, dispatches General John Sullivan into the villages of the Iroquois Confederacy with specific orders, and this is a quote, to totally destroy and devastate their settlements, and the capture of as many prisoners of every age and sex as possible. Now, the unfortunate thing here is that Washington is taking the actions of war parties. So war parties are not representative of entire tribes. They're representative of the people who have joined that war party. And General Washington generalizes that, well, other than the Oneidas, who are loyal to us, the Iroquois Confederacy is responsible for these war party actions, lumping everyone together. So he sends General Sullivan into the villages of the Iroquois Confederacy, and you can see this known as the Sullivan Campaign depicted on this map. All of the red lines and all of the marching, and I also pinpointed on this using a pinpoint, almost like a Google Map style pinpoint, here near Elmira in the southern tier. There was a major Indian village, Old Chemung village, that was absolutely destroyed by General Sullivan and his troops on August 13th of 1779, and just one of the examples of how the incidents that had happened with Joseph Brant were then retaliated against, but against people that had nothing to do with what Joseph Brant had done. Now, when all of this devastating ransacking of villages is taking place, you can see dotted lines here where there was an escape to Fort Niagara. And what's even more tragic is that the British had told the Iroquois, if you're ever attacked, come to Fort Niagara and we will help you. And it's not tragic enough that, if it's not tragic enough, I should say, that General Sullivan destroyed these villages, when they trudged to Fort Niagara, and by now the snow has started to fall, the British kept the gates to Fort Niagara locked and closed and allowed thousands to starve or freeze to death. And so when the question is asked, what is the impact of the American Revolution on Native Americans? It's hard to even put into words, because it can just be boiled down to, it is absolutely devastating. It is not just loss of land. Even more importantly, it is a loss of life, loss of loved ones, loss of homes. And so I can't stress enough how devastating the American Revolution is to the indigenous population in North America. Now, defining economic freedom moving forward. There is a growing belief in this time period of a concept known as free labor. Now, I do not mean slave labor. Indentured servitude had become obsolete because people thought it was contrary to the idea of liberty. Furthermore, if you remember Bacon's Rebellion, it's not a situation the government wants to find themselves in. Lower classes demanding land, the government saying no, and then rebellions happening as a result. And in the South, the system is fully dependent on the system of slavery. There's laws surrounding the purchase, sale, and management of slaveholdings that pop up more and more and more after the founding of the nation. Appearance of slaves in public without a white escort or official papers signed by a master stating their business was outlawed entirely in almost all of the southern states. So very stark in contrast that you have in the North, you have this belief in free labor. People can go about and earn wages or run their own farm and, make it on their own. In the South, however, they are completely dependent on this system of slavery, and the concept of free labor is something they reject because why would I pay labor when I can own it? A famous Abraham Lincoln quote says, "Property is the fruit of labor. Property is desirable, is a positive good in the world. That some should be rich shows that others may become rich, and hence is just encouragement to industry and enterprise." Fancy schmancy 19th century language, but really what he's saying is, I believe very strongly in this system of free labor, and therefore would also not believe at all in the system of slavery. Famous quote from a British poet, Dr. Samuel Johnson. "How is it that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty from the drivers of Negroes?" Southern states kept Thomas Jefferson from putting a clause abolishing slavery into the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson himself owned slaves, but he did want to abolish slavery, and in the midst of being told you cannot do that or the southern states will not participate in declaring independence, he was going to edit it to just be critical of slavery, not about a call for abolishing it, but be critical of it. And even then, southern states said, no, we will not participate unless you strike a clause saying anything about slavery altogether. And Jefferson is encouraged by others, strike the clause so that we can actually achieve independence. Without the southern states, we will never achieve independence. It bothered Jefferson, though, because he wondered, how authentic is my language of all men are created equal? Or life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness going to seem if men hold other humans in bondage, in slavery? In a strange way, though, the only way Southerners could have imagined authentic liberty and self-sufficiency for themselves was to exploit others through slavery. So again, this goes back into that saying we've been using since the beginning of the course. Land is liberty. Well, to Southerners, land and slavery is liberty. We've discussed before, Thomas Jefferson had a second family. Besides his family with his wife, he had a affair with one of his slaves, Sally Hemings. This is the only known depiction here of Sally Hemings, this painting. And anyway, he had this affair with Sally Hemings and had numerous children with her, who he then freed upon his death. But until his death, he owned his own children. Imagine that. And imagine living in a world where that is actually somewhat normal and accepted. Women and the Revolution. Some women did disguise themselves and fight and participate in the revolution itself. But even more importantly, women showed just how important they were to society. They might not be able to vote, but they have great influence over their husbands. And there are good examples of powerful men like John Adams being influenced by their wives. Abigail Adams had perhaps the biggest impact over her husband of anyone in his life. And most importantly of all, not just powerful people like the Adams family, but all women are seen as invaluable to the future of the United States of America and our Republican society, because they're the ones raising future citizens. This is referred to as Republican motherhood. Alongside learning to read and write from their mothers, young girls and boys are learning the principles of living in a constitutional republic. And while they do not have the right to vote, women are still considered epically important to this by leaders, by their husbands, by community members within their communities. Women are, in an odd way, from our own perspective, not respected enough to be given rights like voting, but are absolutely respected at the integral role that they play in raising children in a constitutional republic. And we had this discussion in class, how even today, women are different than men, yes, but different in ways that in some ways are superior. I don't know about anyone else's households, but Mrs. Baker is a heck of a lot more organized and regimented than I am. So, quite honestly, I don't even know when to go to the dentist until she reminds me. She really is the pillar of the Baker household, and this is really what this concept of Republican motherhood means, is that even though in this time period women did not have things like voting rights, they were respected as the centerpieces and the pillars of their households. Luckily today, we can say both, that not only are women pillars of their household, but that they also have equal political rights today. That is the end of the Chapter 6 lecture. If you have any questions, by all means, reach out to me, and I will see you in class.